Yes, so we are live. We can begin.
Hello everyone. I am Dr. Rahul Mandlik, heading medical affairs at Shalina Healthcare Dubai. Today I would like to welcome you all to this webinar where we are going to discuss about one of the burning issues in the treatment of infectious diseases. Let me also welcome our speaker Dr. Om Srivastav. So before we start, briefly about Shalina Healthcare. Today we are one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in sub-Sahara Africa, and from last 35 years it has been our mission of making quality medicines and to make them available across Africa at affordable prices. And we achieve this by manufacturing our medicines at our own WHO approved facilities, and we consider ourselves as one of the integral part of Africa's healthcare value chain system. We partner with several government institutions, pharmacy bodies, as well as NGOs, so that we can roll out variety of healthcare services like conduction of malaria detection camp, antenatal camps, and deworming camps. We also support our doctors, pharmacists, and nurses by organizing free educational programs at our training centers or by using digital platforms like this. In this endeavor, we have started the webinar series, and in these webinars, we ensure and invite regionally as well as internationally renowned therapy experts so that we all can learn from their rich experience. With this, today I'm going to invite Dr. Om Srivastav, who is going to share his thought and guide us on strategies to limit antibiotic resistance and to improve infection control. Dr. Srivastav is a consultant of infectious diseases and HIV medicine at Jaslok Hospital, Saifi Hospital, and Kasturba Hospital, Mumbai, India. Sir has got fellowship in infectious diseases and immunology from Australia. He is a member of Technical Committee of Maharashtra on swine flu in India, and he is a member, invitee, and speaker at International Council of Excellence in Malaria, New York. Dr. Srivastav has authored a book entitled as Amoebiasis, Handbook of Gastroenterology, which is published with McGraw-Hill in 2011. And Sir has also co-authored an ICU protocol book, that is Infections in Immunocompromised Patients. Dr. Srivastav is a principal investigator of one of the landmark clinical trial on raltegravir, which is a new treatment of HIV. And Dr. Srivastav has successfully organized international conference in infectious diseases and HIV, that is Infecon, in Mumbai in 2011. Dr. Srivastav, in collaboration with Harvard Medical School, has trained several doctors in clinical aspects of HIV over a period of 3 years. And Sir has delivered more than 2,000 guest lectures on various renowned platforms nationally and internationally. So while you attend this webinar, please feel free to post your questions, which we'll take up during Q&A discussion. Now, without wasting much time, I would like to hand over the sessions to Dr. Srivastav. Over to you, sir.
So thank you for your kind, generous words of introduction. Thank you and good evening to everybody. We are going to be having a very brief kind of a talk about antibiotic resistance and to improve infection control. I'm going to be sharing some of my thoughts, but then I would like to listen to what your thoughts are. So let us get started without further ado. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm sure in terms of numbers, if you look at just the US figures, which are only US figures, okay, this is not relevant to Africa or India. I think if we do a compact audit on the numbers in either of these countries, just these two countries, we're going to find that these numbers are, a pale comparison of the burden that India is going through. Okay, it's a leading cause of death in the developed world due to number of things: emergence of new diseases, re-emergence of diseases which are which were once controlled, and appearance of antimicrobial resistance. All of these are major factors. The major problem in the treatment of antimicrobial infection is both hospitals and the community, right? Considered as one of the most relevant discoveries of the 20th century. I'm sure you know about starting from penicillin, which was discovered in a piece of bread by Fleming, which was having mold, fungus, kind of a piece of bread that was wet, and that's how he found out about penicillin. So since then, it has quite correctly revolutionized healthcare, led to control and even more eradication of infectious diseases. Mechanism of actions, all right? So there are those antibiotics that will work on the cell wall synthesis. There are those that will work at the nucleic acid synthesis, the DNA gyrase, the RNA polymerase. There will be those that work at the ribosome, the 50S and the 30S parts of the subunits of the ribosome. And there are those that will work, like I said, on the cell membrane. So when you've got a combination of, say, a beta-lactam, beta-lactamase inhibitor, okay, you say piperacillin avibactam, piperacillin subbactam, sulbactam. All right, all of these are agents that are going to be working on the cell wall. Then you say, okay, we'd like to make this effect even more pronounced. And so then you're going to be adding something like say an aminoglycoside, which is either amikacin or gentamicin. What is that going to do? That's going to be working on the ribosome, the 30S or the 50S subunit of the ribosome. So then what you're doing is you're having two agents, both of which will work on the cell wall, the beta-lactam and the beta-lactamase inhibitor. So both of these are going to be ensuring, and I will talk about that in just a minute's time. But then with these two, you're adding an aminoglycoside that works on the ribosome. So now you have a combination that works at three actions, three sites. The cell wall, because the cell wall also produces the ESBLs, and I'll come to that in just a minute's time. And that there is the action which breaks down the ribosome. So hopefully a strategy like this is going to be helping you in actually not just stopping the multiplication, but also ensuring that further cycles and generations of this organism do not get started. Next slide, please. Okay, so why is it that it's a burning issue? Now, there are a number of aspects to this, all right? New resistances will turn up from time to time, irrespective of what you do. When you say irrespective of what you do, oftentimes, all of these organisms have within themselves the potential for a memory. So they'll find out they will record in their memory as to which is the antibiotic that you had used the first time around. This memory then becomes part of the genetic structure of this organism to try and beat whatever combination you have used in the past. And then this memory and this mechanism of beating it becomes a process. So when we say, is this a ESBL producer? When we say it's an extended spectrum beta lactamase, the ESBL production is actually a very complex structure, and it functions at about 90 levels, between 70 and 90 levels in clinical isolates of those organisms that we are treating either in the community or in the hospital. So it's actually it's a contest between people who practice good infection control practices and the bug itself. And so most times you'll agree with me that most times it is the bug that is winning. It's not the hospital. And it is winning so many times over the last several years that the options limited to practitioners, the options left with the practitioners are actually quite limited, right? So resistance is a burning issue. It's a major issue. This slide is very compact. It is nicely presenting what are the problems, but it's not the simplest way. This is oversimplifying. The actual problem is about 1,000 times the slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you look at how the antibiotic resistance started, right, which years we found the antibiotic resistance. But I'll tell you, without going through the years, just try and keep an idea as to what we have done, right? Up until just about 10 years ago, after I came back to India from Australia, up until 10 years ago, you could walk into a chemist and ask for whichever antibiotic you wanted, whichever antibiotic you want. You didn't need a prescription. After that, what happened is that there were bodies and regulatory mechanisms where you could not take any antibiotic that you wanted just because you wanted to. And then after that, it became in the hospital that you could not prescribe any antibiotic that you wanted. You would need to go through some kind of a regulatory mechanism there as well. Since then, the kind of abuse that we've had with antibiotic resistance has slowed down. It has not gone away, It's not likely to go away because the kind of practices that we have will probably take another 20 years to change it, right? And if you see, this is not just limited to India. If you see in a place like, say America, the biggest problem is MRSA, which is both in the community and the hospital. So MRSA, their problem with MRSA is so big that they go through prolonged treatments and combination treatments. We go through prolonged treatments and combinations ourselves, but our problems are mostly the gram negative bugs, not the gram positive bugs. So more a matter of what each country has done in the last maybe 20, 30, 40 years. So penicillin was in the 1940s. Number of antibiotics came up until the 1970s. But after the 70s, because the abuse was so rampant up until then, it's been more a matter of, okay, let us try and limit the abuse, but also try and see if we can reverse it. Limiting is possible. Reversal may not be so easy. Excuse me. But it is something that we will have to do, because otherwise in the future we are going to find that there is no antibiotic left for even the basics, even the most simple. I don't know how many of you have had this experience. Certainly I've had it. Again, just about 10 years ago, an antibiogram used to have, for a particular bug, used to have about 8, 10, 12 kind of antibiotics that you could use against that particular bug. Today it is a matter of, if you have 2 antibiotics which can work against a gram negative bug, then you are lucky. If you have colistin, polymyxin, if you have 1 aminoglycoside, you feel lucky. If there are 3 or 4, you say, wow, this is a very easily treatable infection. But most times in a hospital, you'll find that the bug is pan resistant to everything, including colistin. And then the question comes as to what can we use in that kind of situation. So I'll talk about that when we come into the end of this talk. I'll talk about that. Next slide, please. Resistance, look, as we have seen in the previous 2 slides, there is a mechanism of action and then there is a mechanism of resistance. So as I was saying earlier, that there will be those things that will be picked up, which is the beta lactams, beta lactamases. There will be the extended spectrum beta lactamases. There will be other parts of the enzymatic process that will get picked up. And so when we say that there is a transposon or there is an independent gene in the atmosphere of the bug, this gene gets incorporated into the genetic structure of the bug, and that way it finds a way to protect itself against those antibiotics that were being used against it. So in the initial part, if your antibiotic regimen was going to make sure that the genetic structure was 100% going to respond to this antibiotic regimen, by incorporating another small genetic structure, it becomes 70% sensitive, then 30, 40, 50, and then maybe even lesser, and then it becomes resistant all the time. So there are a number of factors. We say, please finish the antibiotic regimen, please give it for the right duration, for the right route, pick the right antibiotic. All of that is very relevant, but it can't be practiced all the time. So important to keep that in mind as to what you're dealing with, but also to remember that we are, probably our strategy will have to be far cleverer than what it is right now. Because right now it doesn't appear to be that we are getting on top of the antibiotic resistance. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are beta lactamases? Okay, so this is the most critical and clinically widespread enzymes which are responsible for resistance. It leads to, without going into too much details, cleavage, of course, is hydrophilic, where the beta lactam ring gets broken, and that it is present in the beta lactam antibiotics. And because it gets hydrolyzed, all beta lactams, including those which are present in cephalosporins, carbapenems, and monobactams, all of them will get redundant. Next slide, please. Action of beta lactams are inhibitors and adjuvants. Now remember, there are some molecules that we can use to be made into adjuvants. They themselves are not antibiotics, but they can be made into adjuvants to help this beta lactam become more forceful, more powerful. It's like say adding another engine to an aircraft. Okay, that makes it more powerful in the thing that it is meant to be doing. The slide is a good slide, but it is beyond the scope of this talk, because there are so many things that can be used, but they are not always possible in every situation. In most times, you'll find that they can be done only in major centers. Next slide, please. Beta-lactams and the classification, again, you'll find there are a number of technical terms. There are those which are, class A, B, C, and there is a class D. There is also, I'm sorry, so the D comes into the A, B, C category, which are the serine, and those ones which are the metallo-beta-lactamases, they come into the class B, which is a theoretical classification about which are the antibiotics that you can use and you cannot use. Next slide. Okay, extended spectrum, that means the extended spectrum beta lactamases, or the ESBL that I've been mentioning for a little while, are those that will confer more resistance for a longer period of time into these sets of antibiotics. And therefore, it is important for your laboratory to tell you, is your hospital having a certain percentage of ESBLs? Which are the bugs where you're finding the ESBLs? And any hospital in today's times will have between 40 and 95% of their isolates, which will be showing ESBL production. Next slide, please. ESBL amongst, say, E. coli. E. coli, one of the commonest bugs that we see in ourselves. In your country, in Africa, you'll find that it's pretty significant. It's not a small trivial matter. As compared to that, look at India, look at parts of Russia, look at also parts of China. They're a very significant part. Also America, North and South America both. So it's not something that is limited to any one country. It is probably reported in these countries, and that it is important to understand that when you've got a bug like E. coli, which is a very, very common bug in hospital situations, you'll need to first find out how many of these bugs are demonstrating the ESBL growth, and then what are you going to do in terms of antibiotics which can be used in your hospital or in your community. Next slide, please. Hospital, ICU, surgical setups are top risk factors for ESBL spread for a number of reasons. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, you'll find that there are a number of reasons, okay? You may have done your surgery very well, but the infection control has to be as good, all right? When we say prolonged ICU stay, when we say invasive surgical procedures, I also mean that these are situations where there is improper nursing, improper infection control. The surfaces are not being clean enough. The pre-operative and the post-operative care is not good enough. And so all of that will lead to the bug, if it is sitting on, say a bug like Acinetobacter in bacterial infections. Okay, it's going to be sitting on the commonest surfaces in your ICU, from computer screens to the railings of the bed of your patient, to the shower curtains, to the stethoscope. All right, any surface which has got even a little bit of moisture and humidity, you'll find certain bugs are going to be sticking to those parts. When you've got that, you're going to be finding that this bug becomes a colonizer in your patient's urinary tract, in your patient's tracheostomy, in the ventilator. All right, and once it becomes a colonizer, it will almost certainly become a commensal, because all it needs is your patient's immunity to be poor. So remember, when you've got somebody in ICU, their immunity is already about 70% of what it should be. In that kind of situation, you'll find that bugs which should have been commensals or colonizers will become pathogens very quickly. And so, like I was saying a little while earlier, it's a little bit more complex than just putting it onto one slide, but this is one part of the major problem that we have to deal with. Next slide, please. ESBLs and their prevalence. ESBLs are variables in across Africa. I'm quoting your country's in the percentages. It can be as little as 13% up to 62% in East Africa. In many parts of the world, 10 to 40% of strains. In fact, 10 to 40% of strains are a very generous kind of figure. In some hospitals in the subcontinent, it can be as much as 40 to 90%, like I was mentioning earlier. Next slide, please. Prevalence of E. coli, pneumonia, and Proteus mirabilis in the SMART study, from intra-abdominal infections to urinary tract infections. In all of this, there are varying incidences of how you will grow one or another or a third. But also remember that it's fairly common to find all of these bugs in a single patient also. So it's a complex problem, like I keep saying. but it is something to be kept in mind. Next slide, please. What are the factors that are contributing? I've mentioned some of these already I have mentioned. There are those which are related to, poor quality of the drug. There are those which are related to the regulations, the regulators, sorry, not the regulations. There are those which are related to infection control practices, and most times it's a combination of all of these. Next slide, please. Okay, the process of spread of antibiotic resistant bacteria. As I was saying earlier, you can have a very common kind of a spread from either the ventilation of your ICU or the bed end of the ICU, or even simply from the things that you are wearing on your body, your pens, your stethoscope, uh, everything which has the potential of getting contaminated will get contaminated, and from that contamination it becomes a pathogen that has gone onto your patient system and becomes something that you need to treat as a bug in a patient who would have been probably recovering from something else. He would have come into your ICU for a hernia or a small genitourinary procedure, but gets that bug in your hospital. Okay, next slide. Determinants of resistance. Okay, this is an interesting situation. There are variables, right? There are inherent immunocompromised state, like I was telling you, patients who are neonates and very old, but that's not all that is immunocompromised. People who are transplant recipients, people who have got profound neutropenia. There are those patients where there is indwelling catheters for long periods of time, central lines, especially femoral lines. um, there is also the situation of having systemic, those patients who've got therapeutic, prophylactic, topical use of antibiotics, who are on these antibiotics. And of course, there is the kind of things that we have already mentioned, which is increased opportunities for transportation of these bugs, shared equipments, shortened staff, and other things, airborne, waterborne, airborne as in air conditioning, waterborne as in those situations where the water is contaminated. But also a very common thing, very few hospitals will have one-to-one nursing in ICUs. All right, one nurse is required to look after sometimes 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 patients. Right? This has got to do with the number of logistic factors. When you do that, you're never going to be able to conduct yourself in a way that you are not going to be transmitting infection. So you may have done one patient who had the Klebsiella pneumonia in the patient's genitourinary tract. The other patient may be somebody who's got a bone marrow transplant next door to this patient, and the nurse is looking after this patient, both these patients together, and one patient gets to the other patient only because the nurse unfortunately does not have enough time to make sure that all infection control practices are adhered to. Next slide, please. Okay, optimizing antibiotic use, antimicrobial use, what are the recommendations? We've discussed this. You've got to have good nursing practices, you've got to have good quality of medications, you've got to be giving it in the right time, right duration, right dose, and not having short courses of antibiotics, and ensuring that, most important, I'll tell you what is the most important, is that every week, 10, 15 days, you need to have an audit, not once in 3 months, but once in 15 days. You need to have an audit about what you're doing in your ICU. Is there a new outbreak? Is there a reduction in the total amount of numbers from the previous couple of months? And that needs to be done in a very scientific fashion. So that is something that is important. If you don't do that, you're probably going to be missing a major part of what needs to be done in your ICU. Next slide, please. Improve infection control. There are a number of strategies that are employed that can be done. I think we've spoken about some of the things which are basics. I'd like to say a few quick words about the choice of antibiotics. In some of the ICUs that I'm engaged with, I tend to limit the total amount of antibiotics that can be used. If you completely omit 3 categories of antibiotics, which are the carbapenems, which are the aminoglycosides, and the cephalosporins, and you stick to the basics of whatever is available after that, you'll find that in 3 months' time, 4 months' time, your patients are probably going to be much better in a very short period of time. Vaccines, of course, Vaccines contribute a great deal to the increase of immunity, but they need to be made a part of your lifestyle. I now recommend about 5 vaccines after the age of 40, because I know that beyond that stage there are people who will benefit. So you may not be hospitalized for another 25 years, but if you take these vaccines, you are probably going to find that if and when, unfortunately, if and when you get hospitalized, your immune system is far stronger. And there are other things that we also employ to improvise infection control. Some of these I have already discussed. I'm not going to repeat them. Next slide, please. Combination therapy, like I said to you earlier, okay, there is what you can use. It inhibits the targets at different pathways, inhibition of different targets in the same pathway, inhibition of the same target in different ways. So if you were to use a beta lactamase inhibitor, like I was saying, piperacillin, tazobactam, avibactam, which is one of the newer antibiotics, if you were to use any of these combinations where there is a beta lactam and a beta lactamase inhibitor, and you were to combine it, so there is synergy. Now, there are other combinations where you can reduce the pathways. They may be in the same pathway. That means you could start with somebody who is on a carbapenem, right? You can start with somebody who is on imipenem, but you could also add ertapenem. So the ertapenem is meant to actually reduce the total amount of resistance by about 20-30%. And then you have the bigger dose of the imipenem, and that looks at the total amount of the colony count of the bug that you're treating in your ICU. So there are a number of strategies that can be employed. Some of them are smart, clever ones. Some of them are out of desperation. You've got no other option. They will give you results, but you've got to pick the situation correctly as to which is the situation that is going to be benefited most by this strategy. Next slide, please. Okay, so adjuvant, which is a strategy to improve infection control. There is promising, successful strategy. There is also synergy and drug combinations, like I've already mentioned, and that the existing drugs are protected. Next slide, please. So what are these adjuvants we've been talking about for some time? These are molecules with weak or virtually absent activity. They're able to enhance the activity of antibiotics, as I have mentioned earlier. They also suppress the intrinsic resistance, and they are able to increase the bacterial susceptibility to antibiotics, particular kinds of antibiotics. Next slide, please. Types of adjuvants. Okay, there are number of adjuvants. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail here, but they also work at one mechanism, more than one mechanism, one pathway, more than one pathway. Next slide, please. Okay, beta lactamase inhibitors, they are the most successful and clinically used antibiotic adjuvants. There is also, commonly used beta lactamase inhibitors, like I've mentioned, like I've been mentioning all this time, are the drugs like sulbactam, avibactam, and clavulanic acid. Next slide. All right, inhibitors, like again I have been mentioning, there are these which are directly going to be responsible for inhibition of the particular bug. So there are beta lactamase inhibitors that again, there are multiple categories. They work in different mechanisms, but they're all very useful. In combination, they tend to have the kind of results that are desirous in this kind of situation. Next slide, please. Efficacy. Now, various beta-lactam inhibitors are variable in their efficacies. Each molecule has a particular efficacy, and that it does not have to be something that if you have somebody who's got an intra-abdominal abscess, you can use the same antibiotic that you're going to use in an emphysema with a bronchiectasis and the possibility of an evolving pneumonia. All right. So burden of infection and the efficacy in certain fluids of the body are going to be different. It's different also for other groups of antibiotics. I'm not going to be discussing that here, but different groups of antibiotics are going to be having different kind of efficacy in this kind of situation. So you have to pick the right kind of antibiotic in what situation your patient is in trouble in your ICU, so that you're going to get the best results. Next slide, please. Efflux pumps. Now, so there are small molecules that bind to certain pumps, which are called the efflux pump, and block their expression. The entire amount of activity gets blocked. They do not have intrinsic antimicrobial activity, but they are inhibitors of this pump mechanism. Next slide, please. Membrane permeabilizers, like I was saying earlier, there are those agents that will work on the cell wall. There are those that will work with a metabolite that will help then in breaking down the cell wall. This is not applicable only to bacterial infections, but other infections also. But there are those that will make it easier for the antibiotic to go into the cell because the cell wall has been broken down by another agent, which is a permeabilizer. I'm sorry. Next slide, please. So, what is the role of the healthcare professional? We've all got a role to play, not just the GP, not just the nurse, not just the ICU director, not just the microbiologist, not just the pharmacist. Everybody has a role to play, and that working on getting an infection under control is a combination of a little bit of help from all these people, and everybody must ensure that the process that is being set out. So, on paper, you can have a very good policy, but it is going to be useless if you're not able to put it into action, right? So, you've got to find that, look, are there other team players? Answer is yes. Amongst all the other team players, who are the ones? They're the people who have, who are uh, uh, very clearly set out here. And what are you going to do about them? So you need to talk to them. A good intensive care works very well because it keeps in touch with its microbiologist and its pharmacist and the nurses. Everybody has a role to play. I know that in some parts, some medical centers, it is difficult for a nurse to tell a doctor you're making a mistake. But look, that should be welcome. That should be encouraged because, as the slide very correctly says, that everybody has a role to play. Next slide, please. Okay, I think we've done this. I'm going to keep going. Next slide, please. Yeah, we've done this as well. I've already established that. The physician has one role to play, but he is not the biggest role. The biggest role is of the one person who coordinates all these 8 or 9 other players in the role, and everybody is as important. Everybody. I don't think it's fair to say that the doctor is more important than the nurse is less important than a pharmacist. Everybody is as important, and everybody has something to contribute towards patient care. Next slide, please. Yep. Our responsibility again, are you the guardian of the antibiotic use and abuse in your hospital, in your community? Well, there are those situations where you'll need to speak up. You'll need to speak up because if you find that there is something that is happening where an antibiotic is being abused, you've got to ask yourself and you've got to ask the doctor that, look, what are we going to do for the next patient then? If this is the only drug that works and it's going to get resistant after you are not using it adequately or properly in your patient, and it becomes resistant from here, what are we going to offer to the next patient? Is he going to come to the hospital to die? So it is good to speak up. It is fair to speak up, not just good and fair. It is also your responsibility. Next slide, please. So the take-home messages are pretty much what the slide says. Please be aware of what the hospital is doing. Please be aware of what is it that is a resistance. If you're not aware, look it up, read it up, talk to your colleague. If you are aware, then disseminate that information to people who are working with you. Try and practice the best kind of infection control in your ICU, in your hospital. Try also to keep it as flexible, as open, so that when you make too many ideas and policies, somebody is going to break the rules. So try and keep it as open as possible. Talk to each other and do an audit of the practices that you're doing so that you're able to correct the things that are being not being done correctly in your hospital. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to thank all of you. First, for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. Second, for being a very patient listener. I'm done speaking. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them now.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a wonderful presentation. Yeah, there are some questions actually, which I will just like to flash here. There is one question, Dr. Srivastav, about the multiple use of antibiotics and the importance of doing the sensitivity test, because most of the countries in African region or the setups, they are healthcare setups, they are based in the interiors or in rural setup where it is not assured that whether sensitivity test has been carried out or not. So what is the importance in your opinion of bacterial sensitivity testing?
That's a good question. I appreciate the fact that not every center would be having a microbiology laboratory. It's very important to do the sensitivity test. It's like being going from one country in Africa to another with a blindfold on. Okay, when you don't have a sensitivity, you don't know what is the direction that you're going. So if your hospital does not have a laboratory that can look at sensitivity, you must ask your local corporator or council or whoever is the lawmaker to make provisions for having one in the next year's time. Until such time as the laboratory comes up with that sensitivity, you must have a tie up with the closest laboratory to your hospital so that your samples could be sent to those places. And if you don't have any of these things, then you should be in communication with the closest microbiologist to say, look, we've got this problem. Based on your experience, what would be the best antibiotic? That's something I would not recommend, but that can be done. We do that. There are a number of hospitals that do that in my practice. But in the vast majority where I can, I talk to the local lawmakers to say, please make a laboratory here within the next 1 year's time.
Okay. Next question, doctor, is related to injectable antibiotics. And the question is, how effective are the stat doses of injectable antibiotics in controlling the infections, and do they contribute to the bacterial resistance development?
Again, that's a very good question. So look, there are those situations like say some sexually transmitted diseases. Okay, you can give a single dose of ceftriaxone and put the patient onto an oral cephalosporin in certain sexually transmitted diseases, and that's got a good kind of efficacy where you don't need to have prolonged duration of antibiotics. But that's the minority. In the vast majority, you're going to need to give the antibiotics for at least 5 days, 7 days, 10 days before you can find some kind of treatment. See, remember two things. Absence of symptoms is not the same thing as absence of disease. So you may give a 3-day course or a 1-day course or a stat course and say, yeah, the patient's symptoms have disappeared, but that does not mean the disease has disappeared. The disease will come back, and when it comes back, it's going to be resistant to the strategy that you have used this time. So it is important to understand what are you treating, in which context are you being asked to treat this patient, and in that context, what is the bare minimum time? How much of that has to be intravenous? How much of that has to be oral? Once you know that, you'll be able to design your strategy. Strat doses work in some situations, but not always.
Great. So next question is a bit interesting. One of our audience would like to know whether the resistance which is developed maybe in the animals or maybe in plant because of agricultural practices, can that resistance, antimicrobial resistance, pass on to the humans?
So I think the answer to your question is something in one word, emphatically yes. Okay. If you look at the pharmaceutical industry and the animal husbandry, the agriculture industry, they're all fed a lot of antibiotics for them to be having their weight increased because that gets them a better yield, more money, right? But that is something that is coming onto your plate. Now, you may be a vegetarian or you may be a meat consumer, but that antibiotic is coming onto your plate, even if you say that I've had something like a good Caesar salad, or you're having some eggs or some meat, that resistance is going to be coming onto you. So there is no way for you to completely minimize or prohibit that. But there is something to be done in trying to tell your government that you must stop the agriculture industry from feeding the animals with antibiotics. I know that it is easier said than done. I know it's going to take some time. But unless you do it now, the next generation of people in your country are only going to be consuming food, milk, and products of, whether vegetables or fruits, which are going to be infested with those antimicrobials that are only going to confer resistance to the most basic of infections to your system. So please speak up. Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very good question. But I would say that once you know the answer to that, you've got to devise a strategy as to what you're going to do to make sure this kind of thing stops in your country.
And sir, we have seen the data like you have presented about the growth in this problem of bacterial resistance, and even now ESBL data we can see it is widely growing across Africa as well. And there are national level policies in most of the countries, also in Africa. But my next question from the audience, which is related to, despite of the national level policies to control AMR, uh, can some hospitals, maybe secondary, tertiary level hospitals, can they think of developing the databases by including different stakeholders that are involved in the healthcare system, like from doctors to nurses, pharmacists, and everyone? And would like to know from your own experience of developing such database and its importance.
So I think the question that you probably want to ask is, what are you going to do with the data? Yeah, if the data is crippling, if the data shows that your infection control practices were so bad that this is a problem that has come into your city over the last 5 years time, are you going to release it? Are you going to audit it? Are you going to discuss it? Well, I think the answer is no, because nobody wants to be told that while they were ruling or while they were making policies, they made a mistake, right? So what are you going to do with that data? I think it's a very good thought, but before you say I'm going to be putting out that data, please ask yourself, who are you going to discussing this with? Who are you going to discuss this with? So I agree with you. I think that there should be transparency in whatever mistakes have been made, in whatever mistakes have been made. But that's not something that happens in the real world. In the real world, you'll be asked to file that report and put it away. Put it away. But the thing to do, so see, it's a closed door in whatever situation you're working with. It's a closed door. You just have to keep knocking on it. You have to talk to your representative. You have to talk to your policymaker. You have to talk to your government, and you've got to get them to listen, because it's not just about our survival. It's about the next generations of people in your country. So that's what I would do. I think getting the data is very important. What is even more important is sharing that data and sharing it with people who will be able to see. Sometimes there may be a genuine situation where people are not able to see. They're probably not aware that this is the problem they are sitting on. So in those situations, yes, it'll help to talk to people. But once you have done that, you have to take it to the next level.
Sir, next question is related to the type of organism, or which particular microorganism uh, is posing or is about to pose the greatest challenge or threat to humans as far as bacterial resistance is concerned in the near future.
Uh, most times, most times I would have to say it is going to be gram negatives, but that's in my country. Gram negatives are a problem everywhere, everywhere. But most times it's going to be gram negatives in my country. There are also countries like the UK and the US, parts of Australia, parts of New Zealand, where gram positives are the biggest problem. And the other problem, which is coming to be a major problem, at least in where we practice, is fungal infections, which is, Candidemia, Candida auris. So all of these are going to be problems. I don't think that you can say, okay, we are going to be safe from gram positives. There's no such thing as safe. It is unsafe because one is that you've got an infection control practice which is not optimal. That's one. Two is you're not implementing that practice correctly. That is two. Three is that with your infrastructure, when you're making buildings and bridges and new hospitals, there is going to be a little bit of predisposition to fungal infections. And four is that patients will come and go into a public hospital as and when they feel like. Five is your public health and your private health infrastructure enough to look after the burden that is there? So oftentimes you'll find that the maximum duration that you can put up a patient in a hospital is 3 days or 4 days or 5 days. And after that, you've got to ask the patient to go home. We look after you at home. We've got centers in the community who can look after you at home. So it's a complex myriad of problems. It is not quite simple as saying, okay, you've got an E. coli in your brain. I'm going to treat you this with this. The question is, how did the E. coli get into your brain in the first place? Right? So it's got to do with your own immunity, which is low. Why is that low? We need to look at that. If your immunity was robust for your age, you shouldn't have got this infection in the first place. Two is, why did the E. coli come into your system in the first place? All right, how did it get into your brain? So it's gone from somewhere into your bloodstream and then into your brain. 3 is, what have you done to prevent this kind of thing? 4 is, are your hospitals clean enough? Is there enough debris that is getting cleaned so that, when there are certain environmental situations where fungus and bacteria and viruses will grow? Are you doing enough to make sure that that environment is clean as possible? And 5 is, what is your strategy? What kind of plan do you have for none of these problems to grow? So all of these need to be addressed. That's why you need a good infection control strategy, and you need somebody who is the CEO of driving a good infection control practice.
Well, the next question, sir, it is related to the previous question, more or less. All the countries we have seen, like they are showing the different patterns of bacterial resistance based upon the figures which are published. And so like the countries, they are maybe marginally lagging behind in bacterial resistance. Is there any hint, or is there any thing that they can look at the countries where bacterial resistance is very high problem or very big problem, and they can learn from those countries so that they can control and they can implement the control measures in advance?
So look, there is something to be learned in both the situations you have described. Okay, people who have got a bigger problem than you can learn as to how the problem became so big in their country. People who've got a smaller problem than you can learn from them. What are they doing to get not yet have the problem that you have? So if you are able to keep your mind open and learn, there is, there's only something that will benefit your situation. But for that, you need to be, when I say you, I don't mean you, I'm saying that an organization has to be open-minded and say, okay, fine, look, this is where we are. Let's try and find out what this country has done differently, or what this hospital has done differently, and what we can do to replicate their model.
Well, next question, sir, seems to be related to the current situation of COVID-19. Do viruses develop resistance, and why there is a need of taking flu shot every year?
Do viruses develop resistance? Okay, so look, they're actually quite different to a bacteria, in that, infectious organisms which are bigger bodied like a bacteria, even though they've got more genes and they've got more mechanisms to protect themselves. Viruses which are smaller, like the RNA viruses, like the COVID-19 virus. The RNA virus, which is smaller, is more it's more pliable. It can move more quickly. It can escape more quickly. It can make a mechanism of using the environment to protect itself in a better way as compared to say a bacteria or even other viruses. So the RNA viruses are by and large smaller viruses. The DNA viruses are by and large the bigger viruses. So DNA viruses, because they are slower moving, they're not always possible to, first is to cause a lot of damage, two is to get into a lot of resistance. RNA viruses, on the other hand, will go into genomic changes and confer resistance to themselves. So if you look at COVID from March to now, in India alone, the total amount of genomic changes, that is the genetic fingerprint of the virus, that's more than 33, 34, 35. And COVID has more than 1,500 genomic changes the world over, all over the world. Why is this being done? Because viruses will look at the environment and say, what can I use to protect myself? And that's what RNA viruses will do. All right. So resistance, well, yes, it's a given. Only thing is, with the resistance that comes with the virus, how much is it going to impact on the treatment of the virus? It may not necessarily be a resistance that will actually make the treatment of the virus more difficult, but it can be resistance that will, so it takes one step to protect itself, then another step, then another step. By the time it comes to the 500th step, it may have gotten a stage to protect itself. When that will happen, how many changes it takes, what are the gene mutations that are going to be required, we don't know. We just see and hope that this is something that will happen over a period of time, and by the time, hopefully, COVID will have gone out of our lives. And That brings me to your second question, which is the vaccine. Look, vaccine again, if you look at the bivalent vaccine in 2015-16 became the trivalent vaccine in 2018, and it is now the quadrivalent vaccine, yeah, the flu vaccine. That means it has got 4 strains against the commonest viruses in that group. That means the influenza A, influenza B, H1N1, right? Vaccine is a very good idea. It will help your immune system to have a memory of those bugs in that group that are likely to cause you trouble. That means what will happen is if you get, say, 6 infections of the influenza every year, and each infection keeps you in bed for about 2 weeks' time, what will happen is that instead of 6 infections, you may find that you're getting only 3 infections in a year's time. And each time you get an infection, instead of being unwell for 2 weeks, you will be unwell for about 10 days or 9 days or 8 days, right? So it definitely helps your immune system in learning and memorizing which are the bugs that you're likely to be affected with and what it can do to protect you against these bugs. So yes, in one word, the answer to your question, is a vaccine helpful? Answer is yes.
And sir, in addition to antibiotic adjuvants, like we have seen beta-lactamase inhibitors, is there any role of probiotics or prebiotics in the management of this uh, bacterial resistance or maybe resistant infections?
So again, remember one thing that, 90% of your immunity is in your gut, 90%, right? It's got to do with your T cells. It's got to do with those cells which are going to be crucial for the development of your immunity. And like I say, if your liver is intact and your gut is functioning, then that is 90% of your immunity, right? So when you say, let us take a probiotic, what are you trying to do? You're trying to restore the microbial flora of your gut. And in that hope, you're trying to do is that you will get back to having your T cell population to as good as possible in your gut. So there are several strategies that you can do, you can use to restore the flora of your gut. In places like India, when people get bacterial infections when they are using an antibiotic, they will use a lot of yogurt. Yogurt has a bacteria called Lactobacillus acidophilus. Lactobacilli is the one that is used in a probiotic, right? So a lot of people will say, you're having a leaky gut after using antibiotics. Why not have enough yogurt for the day or 2 days or 5 days or 10 days? You can also have the same effect with a probiotic, but the whole point is to try and restore the flora. So yes, it definitely helps. It certainly helps, but you've got to pick the right one.
And sir, also, like in addition to beta-lactamase inhibitors, there are some combination products of antibiotics. When two antibiotics are combined together with different mechanism of action, will it how effective it would be in controlling the resistant infections? And also would like to know on safety side of such combinations.
I'll answer your second question first. Safety side, yeah, it is reasonably safe. Beta lactamases can have problems of dropping counts, hypersensitivity reactions. Those are situations which are not very common. They happen, but they're not as if they'll happen in 80% of patients. So yes, it can be optimized. Right dose, you can use it in patients who've got abnormal liver functions, kidney functions, and still have the best effect of the antibiotic. Uh, Combinations, yes, again, they work. They should be used judiciously. Okay, like I was mentioning, the combination, the example of, say, an imipenem or meropenem in combination with the ertapenem, or using sulbactam or avibactam with clavulanic acid with piperacillin, right? So those combinations along with an aminoglycoside, they definitely work. They are definitely useful, but they've got to be used in the right situation, in the right kind of hospital setting. If you've got a hospital setting where all your isolates in the last 20 days, 30 days, 2 months, 90% of your isolates are resistant to sulbactam, then you've got to be able to rationalize that you shouldn't be using that isolate, right? So it's a matter of rationalizing which are the isolates that are most likely to work in your patient. But once you've done that, it's a very good idea to use a combination antibiotic, and it works very well. Beta-lactams are very effective, very effective.
Right. And sir, is there any guideline, or which is that one guideline which is internationally followed, which you would like to recommend to hospital staff, including medics, paramedics, as well as hospital pharmacists maybe, that can help them, to control bacterial resistance or antibiotic resistance?
So look, there are very good guidelines with the WHO website. If you go to the WHO website, you can go to other free portals, which are, Medscape Infectious Diseases. You can also go to paid websites, which is the uptodate.com, right? All of these will have the data, which will give you the answers that you're seeking, right? But ultimately, look, a guideline, a guideline is only a boundary to say, to not go beyond this point because you'll be making a mistake. Ultimately, you have to translate that guideline as to how it can work best in your hospital. So by all means, go to a guideline, but see how you can rationalize that guideline for your own hospital.
Last question, sir. Talking about the future and the future of control of bacterial resistance, are there any good candidates, drug candidates in development, maybe brothers and sisters of clavulanic acid or tazobactam, so that our future generations will not suffer from the problems which we are suffering today?
Okay, so second part of your comment first. Okay, if we continue to follow the practices that we are doing, we are going to be subjecting the next few generations into a state of despair because there is nothing left to be used for them. Right? That's one. Are there candidates? Yes. Coming out of something as innocuous as plasma, there are going to be candidates that will be useful for targeting specific peptides in infectious diseases. We are also going to be having monoclonal antibodies that will target specific pathways where a certain pathway of infection and inflammation is going to be suppressed. So there are multiple agents which can be used, but like all of these agents, you will need to show that they are of the efficacy that it looks like on paper. Once that is established, yes, I think that there is something to be very hopeful about, but we are not yet there as at this time.
Great. Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful session. And most importantly, thank you so much for answering each question with great clarity. I would also like to thank our audience for taking out time from your busy schedule. And I would also like to convey our sincere thanks to Nigeria Medical Association and PPB from Kenya for accrediting this webinar. Lastly, but most importantly for our audience, please stay tuned to our updates so that you will come to know about our upcoming webinars. Thank you so much.